That right there, that's actual footage of moments in my life, I'll tell you. But hello and welcome to Trinity Radio. You have found the Christian channel that loves atheists. And today we're going to jump right in with this guy who has a special sign just for you. And this is why people hate TikTok. Certain people seem to think that what they are saying doesn't have to have any actual force against the arguments that they're supposedly making, but just as long as we can sacrifice that, we can sacrifice any substantive points about the arguments just in hopes we get like 2 humor points on social media. Just like if we get 2, that would be great. Maybe it'll go viral. But we'll sacrifice all seriousness about the suggestions that we discuss how certain things might impact human sexuality, if there's a God, how God might see these things, child rearing, marriage, the way our culture is functioning. We'll just put all of that aside so that we can get like 2 humor points. Okay, let's just take it at face value, all right? Is this at all like the implied debates and discussions that go on in our culture? Does this really speak to those directly? Well, let's see. Were Jesus's 2 fathers, God the Father and Joseph, were they involved in a homosexual relationship? The answer is no. No, obviously not. And did Jesus also have an earthly mother and an earthly father, Mary and Joseph? Why, yes, he did. So this really doesn't, and we can make relevant points related to that or similar to that with Moses' situation, obviously, as well. What are we meant to do with a video like this? I mean, maybe if it's not just to get some humor points, one might say, well, no, it's to serve as comfort for people that are struggling in these areas. But it can't comfort, at least not in a realistic way, because in order for something to comfort you, it has to be in a healthy way that's going to lead to growth. It's best if those things are true, okay? This isn't true. You say, well, hold on, that's just your opinion. No, don't miss what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about what's true with respect to the arguments related to child rearing, marriage, human sexuality. Regardless of what you think about what's true there, the idea that this sort of a statement tracks to anything related to those actual discussions, if that is supposed to comfort you, it can't comfort you because it doesn't track to those arguments, you see. And so it can't, because almost no one thinks this supports the cultural points underneath the bumper sticker. So what are we doing with stuff like this?
See, I actually believe that every person of faith should be agnostic. Agnostic simply means I don't know. It usually also means I'm open. And see, every person of faith, if we understand faith correctly, is agnostic. Faith is taking a leap. It's saying there is no evidence, there is no certainty, there is no firm knowledge or proof of what I am believing in or what I'm living my life according to. But I'm willing to attempt to follow. I'm willing to be open. I'm willing to trust that maybe there's more going on here than what I can perceive in my finite mind. To be agnostic is to say there may or may not be a God, there may or may not be ultimate purpose or meaning in this world, but I'm going to remain open with wide-eyed wonder at the bigness and beauty of it all and continue to be a nomad on this journey of life.
Okay, so here's a pastor that says you should be agnostic about God. Now, I think what he's doing here is setting agnosticism up against absolute Cartesian certainty, which is the notion that you could know something with a degree that you could not be wrong. It's impossible that you're wrong. And so some people go straight to the I think, therefore I am sort of thing. I'm thinking, so I can't be wrong about that. Some will push it even further and say, well, no, you could still be wrong about that, because in order to conclude that the thinking experience is something that you can't be wrong about because at least you're the one thinking, requires you to use some level of reason, and now you're trusting your reason, but you don't know for sure you can trust your reason, so you can't really have Cartesian certainty about anything. Now, presuppositionalist Christian apologists, on the other hand, will say you can have Cartesian certainty about the truth of Christianity because of the impossibility of the contrary. So there are different ways of thinking about this. But honestly speaking, I'm of the persuasion that at least the vast majority of things that we can claim to know on earth, that we claim to know things about, that we claim to have, assurance of or can be sure of, most of those things, we don't have to have Cartesian certainty about them. And on the other hand, it doesn't mean that we have to be agnostic, right? We can claim to know things that we're not absolutely certain of, things that we have really good evidence for, and we can claim to know them. He says there's no evidence, there's no firm knowledge. Well, here's the thing. That's a claim that he's now making. And frankly, I am suspicious of that claim because I think I know of many good evidences for the truth of God's existence and the truth of Christianity. So now I'm going to need him. If he's going to tell me what I don't know and what I don't have good reason to accept, then he's going to need to throw out what's wrong with all of these arguments. He's going to have to go through, and I don't think he wants to do this type of thing, but I'd be happy to see him try to do this, is to go through all of our arguments and try to show me what's wrong with them, okay? Because you're making a claim that there's no evidence. And we're saying, here's all this evidence. And we know that you've heard about at least some of this evidence. And then lastly, and what stands behind a lot of the problem here, is this understanding of faith that it's just a blind leap in the dark. And that's simply not what faith, biblically speaking, faith is about. If you look at the stories of people who are said to have faith in the Bible, they are often people who had experienced incredible evidential reason to believe that that God exists, that the God of Israel that exists, the Christian God exists. You're seeing incredible, a column of fire, a column of smoke, these kind of things. So, I mean, that seems like a display of evidence. Now you could say, well, yeah, but I don't have access to that evidence, and I don't know that that ever happened. Well, that's not the point. That's what comes back a lot of times when we make this point. No, the point is, whether you think that what the Bible says is true or not, we're talking about what does the Bible mean when it talks about faith? How is it using the word pistis? How is it using this? And when you look at the characters in the Bible, whether you think these things are true or not, when you look at these things in the Bible, the people that are said to have had faith are people who had incredible reason to believe, incredible evidence. So for them, in the Bible, it didn't mean just taking some blind leap much of the time, okay? And then secondly, this just doesn't seem to be the way that the early church used the word. It doesn't seem to be how we used it more like trust or confidence, and that could be on the basis of evidence. In fact, I'll just go ahead and read this to you. This is to Autolycus, book 1. And it has to do with faith. And notice how faith is described here. But you do not believe that the dead are raised. When the resurrection shall take place, then you will believe, whether you want to or not, and your faith shall be reckoned for unbelief, unless you believe now. And why do you not believe? Do you not know that faith is the leading principle in all matters? For what husbandman, now this is where you really need to pay attention, for what husbandman can reap unless he first trusts his seed to the earth? Or who can cross the sea unless he first entrusts himself to the boat and the pilot? And what sick person can be healed unless first he trusts himself to the care of the physician? And what art or knowledge can anyone learn unless he first applies and entrusts himself to the teacher? If then the husbandman trusts the earth, and the sailor the boat, and the sick the physician, will you not place confidence in God even when you hold so many pledges at his hand? So we need to understand the word faith in a way that I think makes sense of what the early church thought about it and what we can make sense of in the Bible. And I think when we do that, we don't come away with this sort of an understanding. In fact, let me just go a little step further. I will admit, he says it's taking a leap. I will admit that faith is taking a step or a leap in some sense, because trust is taking a leap in some sense. We don't always think of it that way. I mean, you're trusting when you sit down in a chair, as so many apologists have said, that when you sit in it, that it won't break beneath your weight. You're trusting that it'll hold you up. And you really don't worry about, oh, it's a leap of faith. Well, it's a sit of faith. Like you're sitting, it's a leap in one sense, it's a step in one sense, but we don't think of it in such dramatic terms, right? Now, obviously, a worldview decision is something more dramatic than that. But here's the thing. to call it a leap does not mean that there's no evidence. So, for example, think of it this way. What if we saw people, and this would be more like, I think, what this guy's understanding would be. We see people cliff jumping, and we don't see what's on the other side of the cliff. We're standing on the surface and far back from the ledge of the cliff. We don't know what's on the other side. And we just see people running and leaping off the edge of that cliff, and we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's on the other. It could be swords pointing up. Could be 1,000 feet down. We don't know, okay? It could be molten lava. So we don't know. Now, that would be something like blind, just running and leaping off the edge. But what we're describing is more like, no. We've done measurements. We've taken a look at this thing. We've you can measure the distance from the lip of the cliff to the surface of the water. You could hear stories about people that at least one person who's come back from the other side to tell you about it. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could put here, and so it's not a leap without evidence. It's not a leap in the dark. You don't have no clue what's on the other side. That's not what's going on. You're trusting. You don't have certainty about it. Well, not if you mean this, it's impossible for someone to be wrong sort of thing. Maybe not. But that comes cheap, because I can't even have that about the existence of the external world. Okay? But I trust that on the basis of the evidence that I'm going to be okay if I take the step of faith or the leap. And anyone who's been cliff diving knows that when you get up to the edge and you look down at the water, you know that this is probably going to be okay. I mean, if physics and all the evidence that you have is probably going to be okay, but there still is that moment where you take the step. And when you take the step, or when you take the leap, it is true that takes something, that there is a resolve that has to be there, right? And I admit that when you become a Christian, that there is something about that means something dramatic, because it means you are committing yourself to a king forever, and you are trusting him. And that is no small thing. But it's not a leap in the dark. It's a step of trust. And this understanding of faith and this understanding of certainty and the interplay between the two creates these kinds of problems. Lastly speaking, if your pastor ever says he is agnostic about the existence of God, if that's what we're to take here, if your pastor ever says that, find another church fast. Now, I love this because I love the honesty, right? I mean, this is great. This is just I'm too lazy for religion, man. I'm too lazy for Christianity, we can imagine her saying. And some people might say, well, yeah, I mean, it's just too much. It's too much to do. I could never do it. But listen, and you've got other people outside of the faith also saying, yeah, and they're all hypocrites. They're all lazy. Here's the thing. You think you're lazy? Welcome to the club. You think you're weak? Welcome to the club. You think that you're self-absorbed? Not saying that she said any of these things except it's too much work or whatever. But whatever of those imperfections, those common failings of people, whatever you think is true, yeah, we are saying those things are true about us sometimes. We're just also saying that's a human thing. Our religion is not saying come here for enough days in a row and suddenly you won't have a sin problem anymore. No, we're saying Jesus paid the price for our sins, and now in response, we want to live a life of gratitude and under the work of the Holy Spirit be made into someone that is more and more like Jesus. But we will mess up, and you will find moments where we mess up throughout our lives. But if you're out there and this is not a criticism, and it's kind of like what this person is saying, just, yeah, I know, but I'm too lazy. Well, take heart in that it's not about you working enough to do something to make yourself ready for this. If you will turn it over to Jesus, if you will trust him, then Jesus will begin a work in your life. And if you're lazy, join the club. If you're narcissistic, join the club. If you're a hypocrite, join the club. We exhibit those things at times. The message of our faith is not we've resolved all of that in terms of our everyday experience. It's that Jesus saved us, and now we live a life of gratitude in response to him.
You put your faith in question, put your faith in doubt. You put your faith in question and you shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. That's why I'm an atheist.
Here are my top 5 reasons I'm not a Christian. Respectfully. Number 1 is what's known as the probabilistic problem of evil. It's just the idea we look out upon the world, we see unimaginable suffering. How many people have starved since the beginning of this video? Is it possible an all-loving God exists? Yeah, it just doesn't seem likely given so much suffering in the world.
Okay, I like this guy. I like that he's trying to be respectful, and he says so. And he also says toward the end that he thinks there are some, quote, solid arguments for God. So with that in mind, let's think about what he's just said. So he's mentioned the probabilistic arguments from evil. Now that is the better family of arguments, because a logical argument from evil seeks to show that it's just that there's some incoherence between a God so defined with the omnis and everything, that's so defined that God exists and the evil that we see exists. So this is like the Epicurean paradox. But that is making a stronger claim, but is easier to respond to, because all you have to do is give any possible explanation for why God might allow evil and have some greater good reason for doing so. That's all you don't even have to know if that's the right answer. Just so long as there is such an answer that might be the case, it takes the teeth out of the argument of saying it must be the case that if God exists, you won't find this evil. All right. And so God does not exist. The probabilistic or evidential arguments from evil aren't saying that. This is why he says, well, I'm not saying it's impossible. And it's because this is making the softer claim, but this is the more difficult family of arguments from evil to deal with, because it's not saying it's impossible that God exists, so defined. It's just saying that, yeah, your theodicies and the answers that you give, the defenses, those are all fine, but it just, it doesn't explain well certain gratuitous evils that seem to have no greater good purpose. There seem to be enough things like that. If you look at someone like William Rowe on this, there seem to be enough things like that at least it lowers the probability dramatically that such a God exists. Now, the reason I mentioned that he said toward the end that there are some, quote, solid arguments for God is that if we have other good reasons that show for, to a high degree of confidence that God exists, then the evidential argument, which doesn't demonstrate God's non-existence, but just makes it less probable, well, now the probability is all out of whack because we have this other thing over here that shows that God does exist. That's why I like to talk about the theistic arguments in the resurrection case, in addition to discussing evidential arguments from evil, or arguments from evil in general, but specifically with the evidential arguments. So that's what I would do with that. And since he does think there are solid arguments, well, then I do think that changes the probability over here, because the evidential argument from evil is something you can discuss on its own. But in criticism of that argument, not only are we going to talk about possible reasons God might have for allowing these evils, but we're also going to bring in these theistic arguments that we think also counterbalance and actually outweigh the evidence that comes to us from the evidential arguments or probabilistic arguments. Let's see what else he has to say.
Number 2 is what's known as divine hiddenness. It's the idea that there are people out there that would believe in God if it was just revealed to them. And there are people today in Africa, the Middle East, that have never even heard of Jesus. They've never heard the gospel even one time. And if a relationship with God is the ultimate good, then it just seems ridiculous that he wouldn't reveal himself to these people.
Now, on this one, what I like is he didn't go the way that you might have actually thought he did go, which is to say, well, these people that are in, that are in what missionaries call the 1040 window, these places where they haven't heard the gospel yet. Okay. You might have thought he was saying, well, look, those people are going to die and go to hell because they never heard the gospel. Then we would respond to that with answers for, how does God judge people who've never heard the gospel, the fate of the unevangelized, as it's sometimes put. And we've talked about that many times, and maybe we'll come back to that at some point. But he doesn't go there. Instead, what he just does is a softer and I think better claim from his perspective is, wait, Jesus, knowing the truth about Jesus, for whatever reason, that's a good thing. That is a really good thing. And it seems unfair, or doesn't seem like it's what God would do if many, many people never encounter that, whether that's because they don't go to hell or just because they don't get to know about the kingdom, right? It could be something like that. What I would want to say about this is, since we're not talking about the fate of the unevangelized, since that wasn't brought in, we can just go with the strict divine hiddenness response, set of responses, which is to say, okay, you're talking about a non-resistant non-believer. And as has been said before, some people find this insulting. I'm just saying it's true that we have psychologists in this world because we don't always entirely understand our own psychology. And so it may be that one thinks that they are completely non-resistant, but all of us have biases, and it's better to understand that we have all biases and try to understand those. Now, I don't know you, whoever you are, person in the red hat or any particular person watching. And so let's say it was true about you that you really are a completely non-resistant non-believer. You would believe, you want to believe if the evidence was just given to you. Well, the way that my friend Jonathan McClatchy deals with this is to say, yeah, and at some point in your life, that should be the case, and you will either, evidence that is reasonable to convince you is there, and you either accept or reject. And you might say, honestly, that has not happened to me, and you might be right, or you might be wrong. But if you're right, then it's coming. It could be coming at some point down the line, at which case you're in no position now to say that it's not ever coming. Okay, that's one thing. Another thing to say about this is what I said in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, which is to say that whether it has been realized by a particular person or not, I think that the evidence that it is reasonable to believe on the basis of this evidence is there already. I think every physical object and every concept in the universe can be used as a part of an incredible argument for God's existence, but at the very least we have the coming into being of the universe itself, and arguments like contingency arguments, the Kalam argument, design arguments, ontological arguments, moral arguments. All of these are, I think, but if you just went with the design argument, which many atheists think is pretty good, I think there is reason to believe at least that there's a God. And then as far as the resurrection, we could talk about a case for the resurrection, the truth of Christianity. So all of that evidence, I think, is there. But it may be that you just haven't been yet, sufficiently convinced of that. And maybe that's coming at some point. These are some thoughts. Another thing that William Lane Craig often says in response to this is to say, even if God gave you the kind of, God is required to give us, God gives us evidence that is sufficient according to us. This is what we think. God gives sufficient evidence. If he's given enough evidence that you should believe, or that it's reasonable for you to believe, God isn't required to give more evidence than what he knows would be sufficient to believe, just because you'd like to see more evidence. I would like to see more evidence, but he's not required to do that. Okay. And it could be that if he were to give us a flashing neon sign in the heavens, and every night people would see that, and people did come to believe, it could be that people, there's a lot of atheists that say if they came to believe that God exists, they wouldn't worship him. Well, it could be that people don't like the oppressive presence of God constantly reminding them of his existence and his doctrines, right? So there's a lot to say about this, so you can choose among that variety.
Number 3 is emotional. If I'm a Christian, I know for a fact there are people that I love that won't make it to heaven. How can that be heaven? It can't be heaven for me if there are people that I love that aren't there. And if you're going to say to me, oh, well, you'll just forget those people, then that's even worse. That's so bad.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily going to say God just wipes away all memory of those people. But I would need to know, to assess this question more, I would need to know what's your understanding of the nature of hell. Okay. If I knew that, then I could understand this better.
Number 4 is just the time between when Jesus died and when the Gospels were written. There's so many arguments over when it was written, yada, yada, yada. At the very least, we can say decades. And to be honest with you, I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. How the hell is someone supposed to remember what Jesus said, what Jesus did, all these things, decades later?
Well, however long you think the time is between when the Gospels were written and the life of Jesus, we still have the creedal statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, and then Paul adds himself, I think, in verse 8. And that was written in the early to mid-50s and is thought of by many scholars to go much further back than that, because it was already in the form of a creedal statement. some people say it goes back to within 3 years of the events themselves. I had Gary Habermas on my show, and I think he mentioned people pushing it back even further than that. But wherever you put it, it's no later than the early to mid 50s, and is thought by scholars to go back much further than that. So wherever you think the Gospels are, the claims about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and appearances to many is all right there in 1 Corinthians 15. So even if you don't think you have the Gospels, that's fine.
And number 5 is just the little contradictions in the Bible. All of these can be explained in some way, right? And when I was a Christian, I had my own little explanation for each one, right? Just because one gospel mentions one colt and the other one just mentions one donkey and then one mentions two, that's not really actually a contradiction. But after a while, these pile up in my brain, and I start to think, would an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect God, would it be this hard to reconcile all of this?
Okay, so you found things that seemed like contradictions, and then you read up on them, and you found, oh, this is not necessarily a contradiction. You said, well, you have a whole bunch of those, and each one's not necessarily a contradiction, but when you have so many, it creates like, I'm taking you to mean this cumulative case where, no, now this does kind of create a situation where I'm now compelled, or I'm less likely to believe because there's so many of these things. But this falls prey to what's called the leaky buckets objection. And that is to say, if you have one bucket that's got a small hole in it, and you say, okay, well, you know, this bucket, I get that this bucket looks impressive when I first put water in it, but that it's got a leak and it doesn't hold water, much like the claim that there are these Bible contradictions in a particular place, but then you found out it's got a leak in it, meaning it's not really a contradiction. So it doesn't really hold water, what I thought was a contradiction. But now there are so many other buckets, and yes, there's a hole in the bottom of each of these buckets, but there's so many leaky buckets that now putting them all together, they hold water. Well, no, they're still all leaky buckets. You say, well, no, you could put the buckets all together and turn them where the holes don't. I don't even know what that means if someone were to bring that objection. The fact that doesn't work with this analogy, all right? There's a hole in each of these buckets. They're leaky buckets, but maybe if I have a whole bunch of leaky buckets, now they hold water. No, if they're leaky buckets, if these contradictions can be explained such that they're not contradictions, then you have a leaky bucket, and having a bunch of leaky buckets doesn't hold any more water than if you have one leaky bucket, ultimately. So I think that's important to mention.
When it comes down to it, there are some solid arguments for the existence of God. I just think some form of atheism or some form of deism have much better explanatory power for the reality that we perceive today.
Well, my friend who's on staff here at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, Andrew Armstrong, watched this video. I said, watch this, tell me what you think, because I like this guy. I think he's a friendly guy. And after he watched it, he said some of the things that I've said here. But in the end, he said, well, yeah, what I'd tell this guy is to keep going, keep studying this stuff. Not in a condescending way. He means it like, hey, if you're saying you think there's some solid arguments on both sides, well, don't give up this quick. You know, keep looking at it, because you may well become convinced that one of these theistic arguments neutralizes at least the intellectual force of the evidential argument from evil. You might come to think similar things about each of these things you brought up, and maybe you'll become a Christian. But I'd love to hear from you if that's the case. And let's go on to the next thing.
That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion.
This one says, me when I was forced to go to church for my entire childhood, and during my confirmation process, my mom proceeded to convert to Buddhism and make me listen to Buddhist CDs in the car. Now, I'm not going to be critical of this person. I mean, I do want them to understand the truth about the Lord Jesus Christ and come back to Christianity or affirm Christianity. Yes, I want that. But I actually want to say something here about this mom, if this is the case, okay? I'm assuming that what I'm being told here is true. And if it's true, then yes, because there are a number of parents who at least initially call themselves Christian parents, but they're nominal Christians, if Christians at all. I'm not saying this is definitely true of her parent. I'm just saying this makes me think of this. Is what they will do is treat religion as a consumer product. So someone goes through a divorce and they need to feel better about life in general. They do need to do some healing. And so they go to the local megachurch where some sort of a pastor feel-good is up there. And this is not always the case with megachurches, but he says some inspirational quotes and things like that make them feel better about their life. And then they go on Tuesday to the yoga studio, and this is a legit yoga studio. And so like they have all kinds of mantras and things like this put on by the Hindu organization here in town. And then on Thursdays, they go to the mosque because the mosque has after school a great basketball program. And so they send their kids over there just for the basketball program. And they just get there. It's just like treating religion as a consumer product. What does each of these religious outlets do for me? Because they're all a part of this Western American culture. And so I'll take what I want from each one like a buffet. This is not what it's supposed to be about. And I will admit that while I don't think there's a problem with any of these things, and my church does these things that I'm about to describe, the notion of having, I want to go to that church because it has the best coffee and the best instrumentalists and the coolest light show and all that sort of thing plays into this notion that religion is a consumer mentality, when the reality is you shouldn't pick your religion or whatever you commit to on the basis of what it can do for you practically speaking, or even what it can do for your kids practically speaking. What you should, or not merely that, I should say. What you should do is, you should look for what's true, and you should follow what's true. And so you should choose a religion based on what's true. And that's how that works. And insofar as there are non-Christian influences around, you want to make sure that people understand where you stand on those issues. Will it annoy your kids? You better believe it will annoy the kids. It used to annoy. Now they've seen it doesn't do any good to say they're annoyed because daddy's going to do this anyway. But if there is, and I don't do this all the time, I'm not like a legalist about this, but if we're watching some entertainment as a family and there is some bombastic anti-Christian messaging, I'm gonna pause it and we're gonna at least say a couple of things about it, right? Well, you're gonna drive your kids away. My kids love me. All right, seriously, I have an incredible relationship with my kids. I love my kids. All right. Well, that's trauma. Well, okay, that's fine. You can call it trauma. It doesn't bother me too much because I don't think it's traumatic to have conversations with my kids about worldview issues. So yeah, I don't. It's not so much that I'm highlighting this because I'm upset with this person, but I do want to highlight the way I think some quote-unquote Christian parents function in America with respect to religion and worldview. And yes, here's the evidence. It creates confusion.
Let's talk about some things in the Bible that don't make sense. First off, the fact that Jesus is a boy. Biologically, he would be a female since Mary didn't actually do the deed with God and there was no sperm to deliver the Y chromosome. Therefore, he literally only would have had an X chromosome, so he's either trans or something's messed up there.
If you don't want to be listen, if you want to be a Christian, don't be a Christian. But internal to the system, if God could create the universe from nothing, like if you could accept that, is there really that big of a problem with the notion that he could ensure that a woman is pregnant with a male baby? Same answer, samesies. Stop it, you guys. Stop it. Stop this madness. All right, in the comments section today, 5 days ago, Foolishly Ludicrous said, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the Big Bang singularity. Currently, there is no information about what could have been before the singularity. This does not mean that existence began at this point, only that we don't know anything about before. So typically when we bring something like the Kalam cosmological argument, in which we want to show that a spaceless, timeless, non-material, sufficiently powerful mind is what's responsible for the beginning of the universe, one of the things we'll do is say, look, the universe is not infinite into the past. It began to exist, and whatever caused the physical universe of space and time and matter to come into existence isn't going to be occupied by space because it's creating space, or made of matter because it's creating matter, or in time because it's creating time. And so we say that the physical universe only stretches so far into the past, and sans the physical universe, whatever caused the physical universe must be spaceless, timeless, and non-material. Then we reason further to get you to a mind, okay? But this person is saying, like, we don't know what comes before the Big Bang. And oftentimes people will say it could have been that there was a big crunch that could have collapsed in on itself and began again. It could be that there's a multiverse. There's all other kind of explanations, but we just don't know because science hasn't gotten us there. Well, you're right. Science hasn't gotten us there. But philosophically, we can make some conclusions, and you have access to that by thinking about it with some simple things in mind. So what we mean is, he says, currently there's no information about what could have been before the singularity. We don't know anything about before. I think we can get to that information using philosophical arguments. Because whether there was some other sort of physical existence prior to that, or whether there is a multiverse of physical existences, all contiguous physical reality is what we're talking about here. And there has to be an explanation for that. And whatever the explanation for that is, would be sans the physical universe. And so in that sense, before it, even though if we're talking about the very beginning, before doesn't have as much purchase there because it's somewhat of a meaningless term. This kind of is similar to another statement that was made by Vinny Giggity, also 5 days ago. He says, I define exist as having extension and or location in space-time. If something doesn't exist for some time and in some place, what does it mean to exist? This is kind of like Matt Dillahunty often will say, or used to say anyway, what does it mean to say something exists for 0 seconds? We're not saying something exists temporally and for 0 seconds. We're saying something exists sans space-time. That's not saying it exists for 0 seconds. We're saying it doesn't exist in a temporal reality. It's like we're talking. It's like if you spoke about without time, sans the physical universe, and so there's no concept of time. There is no time. Then what does it mean to say that God began to exist? Well, that's the point. We don't say he began to exist because beginning and ending are temporal terms that have to do with the physical universe. Now, if you're just saying I can't, but God doesn't exist sans the physical universe because I can't conceive of a timeless existence or a non-material existence or a spaceless existence. Well, I understand that's difficult for us time-bound material creatures to grasp, but your incredulity about it does not an argument make, and I think you would grant that. Also, I want to say here, Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy has sent me an article saying that cat owners have higher intelligence than dog owners. Here's what I want to say about this. IP, does the article tell you how many cat owners were involved in the research that was done? Because I think we can safely assume the only kind of person who would ever think to ask the question, are dog owners or are cat owners smarter than dog owners are cat owners? Dog owners are over here not like, okay, this seems like something you guys would be concerned about. So I think we can have 99% confidence that this is a study that was conducted by all cat owners. And this means it's ridiculously biased. And if you don't think so, IP, I remember a video you made about a couple of years ago about whether atheists have higher intelligence. And you argued that people that reason the way I suspect this reasoning is going have a bigger bias blind spot and are in fact more biased. And besides, here's the thing. I don't know if you folks are aware of toxoplasmosis, but it could be that you're not. The cat owner isn't what's smarter. It's the toxoplasmosis that has already inhabited your brain that is smarter. So enjoy that.
When you think you're the coolest guy in the parking lot, and then this guy shows up.
And on a positive note, I want to read to you a comment from Tim the Ancient, who's one of our patrons, our financial supporters at patreon.com/Trinity Radio. And he says, I'm happy to hear you guys are motivated and energized, and I'm interested to see where everything goes. Oftentimes, the enemies of the cross get to an online space first and then get to run around unopposed. I would say with people like you and other first-generation apologists on YouTube, you guys came in and said, no more of this running around and saying whatever you want to unopposed. There's a new sheriff in town. And I think with YouTube, you guys have successfully done that. No longer can somebody say, no longer can somebody search on a controversial worldview topic and then receive search results only representing the atheist worldview. You guys rose to a point where those atheists like Matt Dillahunty had to contend with you, and now your debate with him is forever setting the record straight, and that's a big accomplishment. I see you coming into TikTok in a similar way. So I really, really do appreciate that. Obviously, I think that some of what he says is over the top or exaggerated, but that someone thinks that is very encouraging. And ultimately, it's because we want people to know our King, the Lord Jesus Christ. And I hope that you'll trust him today. If you do, or if you don't, reach out to us at braxton@trinityradio.org. And I'd love to hear from you. And with that, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.